Hey, how's it going, everybody? In this video, I just want to talk a little bit about this car barge, which is sort of the operational center point of my layout, and how I custom built a 3-track car barge from a 2-track Sylvan model car barge. And I don't have video of the whole build process, so I just am going to give you kind of a quick overview of the model first, and then we'll do maybe a little painting. If I can get the camera to focus on it, there we go. So you can see I've done a full 3-track layout on top of this deck of the barge. I want to mention that I'm definitely not an expert on rail marine operations or anything like that. This is just sort of more of an impressionistic version of a car barge, and I just want to go over how I achieved it, because as far as N-scale goes, I don't necessarily know of anybody else who is doing rail marine operations in N-scale, and at least to the degree of fidelity that I'm trying to achieve. There's a couple other people on YouTube who I do enjoy watching, who do N-scale to the same sort of degree of fidelity that I'm looking to achieve. So I'm definitely not anywhere on on the same level as them, but I am trying to get a very realistic look as best as I can. And the main thing with this car barge is that the Sylvan Models kit, it's a resin kit. It's pretty good. I don't really have a whole lot of experience working with resins, so take that with a grain of salt. But this kit is pretty good. I think maybe the main problem is that you get a little bit of a bow in the shape of this. I don't really know how to resolve that, but it doesn't bother me too much. But the kit that it comes with, the way it's set up, is a 2-track kit. So this is actually the original deck that comes with the Sylvan model itself. And it's, I guess it's a piece of styrene. I'm not really sure what this material is. It feels like styrene. But this is my second model. The first one I did was for my previous layout, and I built it as the instructions intended. And it's just a 2-track barge, which I don't really know why they made it a 2-track. The HO scale version is a 3-track, and the N scale version is a 2-track, and there's not very many 2-track prototypes out there in real life. So I wanted to try to model the 3-track because the New York Cross Harbor had barges that were 3 tracks, and I just wanted to have more freight cars than the 2-track could deal with. So this was my previous model off of the previous layout. You could still see some of the water material that I need to kind of carve off of here, but I wanted to try to save the model because I really liked the weathering and the details, and that's pretty much the same thing that I'm going to try to achieve with this one. But this is pretty much as built, with some of the water still stuck onto it and some of the other details. But you can see there's a decent amount of detail on here right out of the box. You've got the cleats, or whatever these are called, for the, tying everything down. I added some chains. There's a lot of these little rivets that the rail sits on top of. That comes pre-molded in. We'll take a look at the actual original one. And there's these little ports that are sort of all around the place. I don't really know exactly what those are for, but they are on here. So let's take a look at the Sylvan Models deck itself. Let's see if I can get it to focus. There we go. So you can see that it does come with these pre-molded, I don't know what you would call these, things for your track to lay into, like some kind of clamp or something like that. And it also has the little circle manhole looking pieces on there as well. And it also has some spots for the cleats, or I know I'm calling those wrong. That is not the right name, but I'm gonna call them cleats for now, to mount into. So obviously, if I'm gonna make a 3-deck version here, which I did, I am not gonna have any of those details. So I wanted to try to recreate that as best as possible. And if we can get a close look here, I think I did a pretty good job replicating that. And I'll talk about how I did that in a second. The first thing that I want to note is that a lot of the prototype car barges, when they have the 3 tracks on here, the center track actually has a turnout mounted on the barge itself, and it's usually a Y. I couldn't really figure out how to achieve that without doing a whole lot of custom building, which I'm just too inexperienced for that. So I opted to put the turnout for the center rail on the car apron, and or on the apron, the float apron. So that will be a custom build in itself. I'll have to talk about that separately, but that just sort of helped simplify it for me so I didn't have to figure out how to mount a turnout on here. So essentially what I did was I positioned the turnout where I wanted it. I figured out how the track was gonna be spaced on here, and just one by one, I began to lay out the track. I had already traced everything out on grid paper. I planned where everything was gonna go. I didn't just wing it. But I first laid all the track down. I used little hand laying track spacers and stuff like that, and I measured everything so that they were evenly spaced. And as I was going, I simply just used CA super glue to glue all of the rail down and glue it into place. And hopefully it holds in the long term. It's holding pretty good right now. The only downside with using super glue is that you get a lot of these little crusties. Like you can kind of see like some streaking in some of these places here and there. That's from the super glue sort of like leaving, I don't know, crusty pieces. But it doesn't bother me because once I paint this and once I rust it, it's gonna blend right in. So I'm not too worried about that. But now, how did I achieve all the details on here? Well, the cleats came with the model. So I just used the original cleats that came with the model. They're also resin, and they come on this sort of resin sheet that you just sort of pop off. And so I used those, but they are mounted onto a little piece of rectangular styrene that I put on there and drilled a hole into. So I measured those out and cut the styrene to the right size. And then for these little pieces here, I actually used a hole punch on a very thin piece of styrene and just punched out the holes and stuck it on. And I think the look is pretty good. It matches pretty much the way that the out of the box looks, in my opinion. I tried to line everything up. I measured everything as close as I could. And of course I looked at prototype pictures while I was doing all this just to make sure that it was somewhat accurate at least. Same with the measurements for the cleats and that sort of thing. The real painstaking part was putting all of these little rivets in here for the rail. So as I said, the rail was already laid down. And what I did was just take some styrene. I used some of this 1 millimeter styrene strip, very, very thin strips of styrene, and I cut them into, I think it's just 1 millimeter, or no, 10 millimeter lengths. I can't remember what the measurement was. I want to say it was 10 millimeters, 1 centimeter? I don't know. I tend to work in metric when I'm measuring this stuff because it's a little bit more simple, at least for my mind, than thinking about fractions. So you'll hear me reference mostly metric when I'm talking about measurements and stuff, but I think these are about a centimeter each. And I think I had to cut down about 500 of these things and place them one at a time. And I did use styrene CA to glue to the styrene. I really probably should have used some of this Plastruct stuff, but instead I just used regular old Zap CA. And again, it left some crusties here and there, but that doesn't really bother me too much on this particular model because it's all gonna get rusted anyway. Additionally, for these like sheets that are on here, and I also did it on this one, you can kind of see some of these flaking pieces that are all around in the middle, in between the rails. There's one right here. Let's see if I can get it to focus. Yeah, so you can kind of see some of these like flaked up areas of the deck. I really wanted to achieve that because if you look at prototype photos, these things are just weathered like you can't even imagine, because this particular barge lives in salt water. It lives in New York Harbor, so it just gets chewed up. So in order to achieve the flaking on here, I actually used some of the resin, I'm gonna call it resin paper. This is like the flashing, I guess, that came attached to the kit, like the back side of it and stuff like that. So it's like it's very thin and it's kind of pliable. So I just sort of like tear it up into like random pieces, and then I glued it right to the deck. And then once I paint it, that's gonna sort of stand up a little bit and stand out as these sort of flaking pieces that cover the deck. At least that's the hope. I also used some jewelry, some old jewelry that my wife had for some chains, and I'll also add some ropes and other details to the surface. But that's basically an overview of this particular barge that I put together just based off of this 2-track version. I guess I forgot to mention, I cut the deck using this as a template, which, I mean, I guess that should be sort of self-explanatory, but I basically just put this down on a piece of thicker styrene, traced it out, and then cut it out, and it fit right on top just fine. So there's some other details that I want to add on here as well, so we'll get to that probably in just a moment, but I think that about covers some of the details on my car float. I forgot to mention that after I assembled everything, I primed it with just a plain flat rattle can gray primer, and then I cleaned off the top of the tracks. And that gives me a nice flat gray to weather over top of. And in fact, that's the same color that is on the hull of my last model. I didn't even paint it any other color. It's really kind of difficult to see, but once you add some rust and stuff like that, it acts as a pretty good base. But that was just Krylon rattle can flat gray primer.
All right, let's get painting this thing. I'm going to be using Bar Mills weathering chalks as well as some dull coat lacquer liquid format to create a rust effect across the whole thing. Hang on, wait a second. What is that? Back up. Yep, that's exactly what you think it is. That is paint stripper and not lacquer. I grabbed the wrong bottle. Yeah, go ahead. It poured a little bit funny. Give it a good shake. Maybe that'll help. No. This is paint stripper. I proceed to paint this entire model with paint stripper. It is very awful to watch, but it is a lesson for you guys too, and myself, to make sure you are using the proper equipment and the proper tools and the proper paints that you think that you have grabbed. Double check everything. I think I was just a little bit too wrapped up with making sure the shot looked good, and I grabbed the bottle that was next to the bottle that I intended to grab. Always double check what you're doing. So the technique that I'm using here, or at least the technique that I think I'm using here, is to take a rust-colored chalk or powder and make it into a paste using lacquer. And in doing so, you create a lot of texture with it. And using paint stripper also creates a lot of texture, but it's the wrong kind of texture. But when you mix dull coat with a chalk and you make a really thick paste, you get that really crackly looking rust texture. And that's the technique that I used on my other car barge that you saw earlier with a great deal of success when it's done properly. And the lacquer helps kind of hold it in place without it like losing its color, I guess. Usually when you put a dull coat over a chalk, it loses a lot of color and contrast and just sort of becomes this murky mess, which eventually is what happens here too. But if you do it correctly, you don't end up with a really washed out mess. You end up with like a really nice rusty, crackly, not crackly, but you get some texture out of it. That's really what I'm trying to say, is doing this technique gives you some texture. And that's really what I was after. So it's actually kind of funny for me to be watching this in time-lapse format now, because if you look closely, you can actually see the paint beginning to crackle up on the left-hand side of the ship here. And it's about this point, I was probably painting this for about 15 or 20 minutes, but it's about this point that I finally noticed that something's going on here. And I remember thinking to myself, this dull coat or this lacquer is having some strange reaction with the paint. Maybe it's the primer, and I couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. And I'm like, this is actually kind of a cool look. Like the paint was beginning to crackle and get kind of wrinkly and made a really cool weathering look. Right here, you can see I'm showing it to the camera because I thought it looked cool, but I had no idea that what I was doing was ruining the paint on this. But we're gonna fix that in a second. What I decided to do was let it sit for a couple of days in the hopes that it would eventually just dry out and go back to normal, which was not the case. So now we gotta fix it. So after I allowed the model to dry for like 3 or 4 days, I was really, really hopeful that it was just going to reset itself and whatever. But the way that paint remover or paint stripper works is that that's not the case. The damage is done. It has a chemical reaction. The paint was coming up. So I realized I was committed to removing all of the paint and doing this all over again, which I was really reluctant to do. But I was very thankful that none of the glue came up. That was my biggest fear in all of this. I knew I could repaint the model. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. And if nothing else, I would get a little free weathering out of it, you know, with some of the chipping effects and that sort of thing. But my biggest fear was that the rail was going to come up, or all of those little details, the cleats and the manhole cover things and all that were going to come up. But thankfully the super glue held, and all 500 of those tie plates underneath the rails held in place too. I think maybe like 2 of the tie plates came up, and it really wasn't that big of a deal to glue them back down. And while we're at it, let's make sure this doesn't ever happen again. And let's put a label right on there so I don't make the same mistake. There we go. Okay, so finally getting to the technique that I had initially set off to do. I've got the actual lacquer on my workbench here that I'm going to be using. I've got the chalks that I'm going to use, and we're going to create a paste and do this the way that I had originally intended. But this is not the last of our worries. They're not behind us. There is still one more problem that I did not foresee, which we're going to see in a moment here. But you can see that the paste is going on nice and properly this time. I'm using a blend of the oranges and the yellows and the reds to just create a bit of a rusting pattern, thicker in some areas and not so thick in other areas, just sort of adding some variation here and there. But this is basically going to end up being a base for the next layer of rust weathering that goes on top. I also want to point out that this is probably going to be the last time I use this technique with the chalk and the lacquer, because chalk is just way too messy and the effect that you get with it is just not really that great anyway. So I'm probably not going to use chalks anymore, and you'll see why in a moment.
So I applied a coat of dull coat to this, which really nerfed the color in here, but that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. This sort of like darker texture is totally fine. I could definitely work with this, but check this out. I don't know if this is some kind of chemical reaction here or if this is some kind of crazing, but there's like all these like little bubbly, crusty pieces kind of like boiling up here. It's all dry. So I don't know if that's from the dull coat mixing with some of the lacquer. Maybe the lacquer didn't totally evaporate off, or if it's mixing with something else and just causing this sort of like rough, gritty, I don't even know what that is. It's on there. It's not coming off. It's like glued down. So, I mean, on any other model, this would probably be pretty problematic, but on this one, I'm gonna use it as free weathering. So I'm gonna work with this. I'm actually going to use some of these MIG rust colors here, medium rust probably, and the dark rust, and just sort of work with some of the textures that I've got already going on in here. It's really rough and corroded looking, which is exactly what the prototype looks like. So I'm kind of excited about that actually. It's sort of a happy accident, I guess.
So the moral of the story there is don't make these mistakes on models that you don't want to turn into a big rust bucket like this. It is fine for something like this, but definitely be aware of what you're doing if you've got if you're working on a building or something that you don't want to have this sort of crackly texture to it. In this case, it works great for me, and it ends up looking really great in the end, but on any other model, this is going to be a big problem. So don't apply dull coat over top of paint thinner unless you know that the paint thinner or paint remover, whatever, is totally evaporated away, because I think that that's exactly what caused the problem. But anyway, the last little bit of weathering that I'm going to do here, you could see that when I applied the dull coat over the top of the barge, it completely neutralized all of those chalks that I spent so much time putting on there, which is one reason why I'm probably never going to do that again. But secondly, you get a much better effect with this paint here. I'm using these rust colors by MIG. And I got them online, and these are probably some of the best rusting acrylic paints I have ever used. I use them on everything now. They apply really, really nicely. They don't need to be thinned if you're just kind of like painting them on the way I'm doing it now. If you want to run it through an airbrush, you definitely need to thin it out. But these are fantastic paints. The color is amazing, and they're acrylics, so they're super easy to work with and easy to clean up, and you can layer them. They're just very versatile. And because they're acrylics, you can see it's very bright right now as I'm applying this, but as it dries, acrylics dry a little bit darker than when they go on wet. So it looks a little bit bright right now, but by the end of it, it is a nice darker tone, and it's got a very realistic rusting appearance. So I used a couple techniques here, mainly using a makeup brush to stipple on some splotchy areas, and I took two of my worst brushes and used those to create some streaking in some areas. And these are like dollar store brushes. I don't even know where they came from. I think I might have found them on the side of the street or something like that. They're abysmally bad for anything except for something like this. But this turned out really, really nice. I'm very happy with it. I let it dry overnight before I started scraping up any of the paint off of the rails, and we'll take a look at the finished product in just a moment. Yes, I already forgot about this. Before we take a look at the final product here, I have one more detail to add. I've got my book here, the New York Cross Harbor book. This is the prototype that I've been using as reference here. And you'll see in this bottom corner here, there is a 16 painted on the deck of this barge. This is because this is barge number 16. So it's a little detail that I wanted to include on this as well. So me and my shaky hands are going to attempt to write a number 16 on the deck of this, and I think it looks pretty good and adds some more authenticity to the final model. So there you have it, a Rust Bucket 3-track car barge in N-Scale. I'm personally pretty proud of this model. It has been several months in the works. Right now it is the middle of October, not August. It's the middle of October, and I think I started this model back in July, maybe even June. So I've been picking away at it a little bit at a time. I'm very happy with the results. I'll put some flashy close-up images on the screen for you guys to gawk at for a little bit. But I hope you guys found this video interesting, entertaining, or informative. Something. I hope you're getting something out of these videos. I enjoyed making it, and I really am happy with how this has turned out so far. So let me know your thoughts if you guys have done anything similar, or if you use MIG paints, or if you've ever accidentally put paint thinner on one of your models. I'd be interested in hearing it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.